Greetings, everyone. Joining me today on the Next Gen North podcast is Karen Sheldon. Karen has been known in the Territory for 50 years as an esteemed entrepreneur, as a proponent of closing the gap by providing Indigenous people with economic opportunities, and was appointed as a member of the Order of Australia. In today's episode, she takes us from her journey starting at the Barrow Creek Roadhouse through to Tennant Creek and the creation of the Dolly Pot Inn, and now where she finishes in Darwin as the co-chair of Saltbush. I hope you enjoy this episode. Karen, thank you for joining us on the Next Gen North podcast. We're really thrilled to have you here.
You're welcome.
If you don't mind me starting on more of a personal note, if I may, I look back on my time in Tennant Creek really fondly. And I guess for the sake of our audience who wouldn't know, I lived in Tennant Creek for 8 years, from 1992 to about 2000. Excuse me. And the vast majority of that was spent across the road from your famous Dolly Pot Inn. When you look back at those days, does it seem like a blur to you, or are those memories quite vivid in your mind still?
I think, Stuart, because they were so intense memories, I think they're still quite strong.
Yeah.
I must admit, so many people passed through Tennant Creek and the Dolly Pot in those days that sometimes I feel like I see a face but I don't know which era it came from. But I guess the joy of running my own business and the great charisma and memories that place has are still pretty strong, really. Yep. And your family was a very strong part of that.
Well, I'm really keen to get into all that sort of stuff, the Tennant Creek stories, because as you know, Tennant holds a very special place in my heart still.
Yep.
But before we do...
you were just an ankle biter in those days.
Yeah, that's right. It was a long time ago now. But on this podcast, what we like to do is maybe just take it from the start, for our guests to maybe walk us through their early life, if they're not from the Territory, how they came to be in the Territory and sort of what drew them here. So.
Yep. So I was a Victorian girl, brought up in the Dandenongs, in the rough Cobb and Co. Tracks of the early days. Born in 1948, so a very, very long time ago now. And then my family moved to Benalla in the northeast for my high school days. So in Victoria, growing up, basically I'd never met an Aboriginal person, didn't know anything about Aboriginal history, except what we learned about boomerangs and Captain Cook and things like that in school.
Sure.
But I had quite a chaotic childhood because my mum had schizophrenia, which we didn't know it was called that then.
Right.
And I was the oldest of 5 kids, so quite a traumatic and chaotic lifestyle where you never knew. My mum, we had a little saying about her. She was like the little girl that had a little curl in the middle of her forehead. When she was good, she was very, very good. When she was bad, she was absolutely horrid. So we never knew what we were going to wake up to in the day. So I guess that gave me a really good background for the work I was going to go on and do later on, because there's a lot of parallels.
Sure.
So a girlfriend and I had been doing a double job in Benalla. I was doing a boring office job where I used to go to sleep at work and have to come back at night and finish booking out the pig sales and things like that for a land company. And then I went to work at the Winton Hotel at night time out at the Winton racetrack. There was a 24-hour servo there, and my girlfriend and I used to do the night shifts to save money to go on a cherry blossom cruise to Japan. But somehow the cherry blossom cruise got cancelled, and we were both sitting out there moaning about that one night, and one of the Pioneer bus drivers said to us, "Well, you need to come to Alice Springs, you guys." And I thought, Alice Springs, I don't even hardly know where it is, except I've had a picture of Mount Gillen on my lounge room wall since I grew up, because Mum used to be a land girl in Alice Springs during the war. So anyhow, we set off with that very same Pioneer driver who my girlfriend fell in love with. on the trek to Alice Springs. I must have had inflated ideas of how far money would go because I kind of ran out of money in Alice Springs when we got there, and so I had to get a job. And I got a job at the Ansett Hotel, and that was putting little sprigs of parsley on Ansett airline meals, hundreds of them all laid out in front of me, and saying, "Oh, I've always wanted to be a chef." And, you know, Alice Springs was a very small town in those days, but very close town. And I was pretty frightened of when I went out on the streets and saw all those black faces, you know, that I'd never seen before.
Yep.
So it was like coming into another world.
Sure.
But I was really enjoying working physically cooking rather than doing what I'd done before. So anyhow, one day one lady came along to me and she said, "Oh, I hear you're a cook." And I said, "Oh, God, no, but I've always wanted to be. My grandmother always wanted me to be a cook." And she said, "Well, congratulations, here's your bus ticket to Barrow Creek. You're the new cook at the Barrow Creek Hotel." And she gave me a one-way bus ticket. And so set off in the Pioneer bus to Barrow Creek one afternoon, arrived at Barrow Creek just as the sun was setting, and I was looking for the town because I thought it would be kind of like Alice Springs, that there's one light here and one light over in distance somewhere. I thought maybe the town's behind those beautiful mesa hills that I can see. But no, a cranky white lady came out of the one lighted door and said to me, "Are you the new cook?" And I said, "Yes." She said, "Well, grab your bags and come and help me do the cooking for this bus." And that was my introduction to the world of commercial cookery. Wow. So I always say that was my sliding doors moment in life, because if I could have got back on that bus and kept going, I certainly would have, but I had only a one-way ticket to Barrow Creek.
Yep.
And, you know, the interesting part about all that is that by the time I could afford to buy a bus ticket out of Barrow Creek, I was having so much fun that I didn't want to.
Right.
And I was having so much fun because I'd gone there with Margaret Fulton tucked under my arm, the Margaret Fulton cookbook, the Bible of early Australian cookery before Google or any other recipe books. And so I was having fun cooking my way through with Margaret Fulton. And but the other thing that really got me was that even though I was absolutely terrified of Aboriginal people, so many of them were associated with the operation of the Barrow Creek pub, that they were the ones that made me feel so welcome to their country, and they were the ones that helped me in those early days to find my way around, not only inside the kitchen of the pub, where they did all the housekeeping and dishes and that sort of thing, but also in the raw, real desert drought country that was Barrow Creek at that time.
Yep.
In that area of Central Australia. So ended up staying at Barrow Creek for 5 years.
Wow.
Ended up graduating from Margaret Fulton, and I actually wrote to her one day and said, "You've left the butter out of one of your recipes." I had to make it up, and she fixed that in the next edition, so I was pretty happy about that.
There you go.
But I'd graduated to the Time Life Foods of the World, and every month a new Food of the World volume would arrive at Barrow Creek, and we'd be cooking the foods of Southeast Asia or contemporary French cooking or something like that for the next month while I was experimenting. And, you know, it was a wonderful apprenticeship in a way, self-apprenticeship, because not only did I learn how to make things, and I could keep practising on the ever-ending stream of people that went through Barrow Creek in those days, but I could also keep practising until I got something right. So it was and also I was learning about why olives and tomatoes go together and all those sorts of background history of food. So it was a great apprenticeship. But, you know, it was the local Kaiditch people, the local Aboriginal people. I spent so much time with them and learning such, you know, how they survived in that desert region. That made me develop such a strong sense of understanding of, you know, what was going on, and also just the way their intrinsic resourcefulness and love of their country and and sadness about what was happening to their ways of life.
Mm-hmm.
And I only saw glimpses of it, but, it made me start to think about what in the hell was going on in Australia.
Right.
So 5 years on, moved on to set up business with my husband in Tennant Creek.
Just before we do that, if you don't
Yeah.
mind, what was life like in Barrow Creek in terms of, how did you spend your free time? Did you have free time, or were you just so busy at the pub there, with the clientele coming in and out?
Yeah.
How did you spend your time?
There was no such thing as the Fair Work Act in those days, and you just cooked 7 days a week
Right.
and kept going.
Yeah.
But because I was enjoying it so much, you just had to be there when it needed to be done. Life was really a total change for me, and a big adventure. I felt like I was in pioneer country because things were so raw. The Barrow Creek pub was one of the main stopping places in those days because there wasn't long-range fuel tanks or anything like that.
Right.
So most people stopped at Barrow Creek, and you really got to know the truckies and people like that. Like I'd get the phone call from the trucking company, I'm looking for number 34. He's supposed to be somewhere between Alice Springs and Tennant Creek, but he hasn't checked in. And I'd be looking at it, about 20 road trains parked out the front, all having a big party and saying, oh, no, I haven't seen him. I don't know, One of the favourite tricks of the truckies in those days where they were all used to have a party at every roadhouse, someone would go out and actually go, and there was a turn up around a few hundred metres away.
Yep.
They'd go and turn a road train round and make it facing the other way, and the truckie would get out of it full of beans and half asleep the next day and just drive off in the wrong direction. It was a little trick they used
Prank
to play
culture.
on each other.
Yeah.
Wouldn't get away with that now, but but it was very pioneering time, and people appreciated whatever I cooked because before that at the Barrow Creek pub there'd been steak or corned beef, whereas I was innovating and learning how to cook, so it was great.
Which was probably pretty similar along the track, I guess, steak and corn, it's just similar sort of fare, right?
Yeah, and that's where I really developed that real love of finding out about food and doing it the best I possibly could, I guess. But also finding out about local Aboriginal people and Aboriginal law.
Yep.
And understanding a little bit about people, like one of our amazing house girls, as we used to call them, Ivy, her husband was the tribal elder and he passed, and I was just absolutely amazed that the whole tribe picked up their camp and moved stakes.
Right.
Even in the middle of summer, that, I thought, wow. And, they lived in such primitive ways, like we're talking about bits of trees and hessian and canvas propped up against,
Like a lean-to.
real humpies, real lean-tos.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
Yep.
And we had sort of a few buildings out back where they used to often stay, and they were sort of like really dark black rooms that you'd go into and think, how could people, because they'd have a fire in the middle and that sort of thing.
Yep.
So for me it was a real eye-opener. How can people live like that? And I have to say, I'm sad to say that the culture I came into those days was very racially divided. You have to remember
Right.
that was only 3 years after Aboriginal people had been recognised
In the Constitution.
as human beings
Yep,
virtually.
yep.
They hadn't been counted in any census before that. So I didn't know that history and that much about that. I was very, very raw and uneducated in that way.
Yep.
Because I'd come from my nice little white life,
Yep.
And so that was a real culture shock for me. And for instance, when Ivy got ostracised because her husband had died and there was all these cultural protocols that happened.
Yep.
And it turned out that we went down the road and found one of these little old round caravans, wooden caravans that had been abandoned on the side of the road, and I got them to drag that up to the Barrow Creek pub so she had somewhere to live because she didn't have anywhere to live when her husband died and the whole tribe moved away. And
Right.
I didn't understand any of that culture.
Yep.
But I did have great fun over the years with people. Like I taught the women to drive because they'd earn enough money to get a car, but the car would always be stolen by their nephews and nieces. So, and, you know, huge savvy on motor vehicles and how to make things work. Even old bombs, they'd get them working.
Yep.
There was one day when up at the Barrow Creek pub came a Nissan Cedric with an old couple in it, and they came into the pub to have a meal, and when they went to leave, their car wouldn't start, and so I had to go and get my husband, who was actually my boss in those days, but he was also a mechanic, Clary Sheldon, to go out and have a look at their car. And as soon as he opened the bonnet, he looked in and he saw that their rotor button was missing. And he said, I can fix that for you, just a moment, I'll be about half an hour. Drove out to the Neutral Junction station where he knew there was an old bomb of a Nissan Cedric that the tribe had been trying to get going that happened to be missing a rotor button.
Right.
And they'd actually picked it up and quickly while the couple had dinner. So that's how quick people were, you know, how innovative and resourceful people were.
Yep.
So the couple was able to go on their merry way with their rotor button intact after that. But, you know, going out bush with people, understanding how they lived, we shared lots of different things. I taught the women how to drive and helped them get their licence. We used to sort of like bribe the Tea Tree policeman to come up from Tea Tree, which was 60 k's away, and take them for their licence. And I'd been teaching them for a year or so to drive so they could get their licence, and that way their nephews and kids couldn't pinch their cars in future and they'd keep them. But also they just taught me so much about their law and their culture, and you know, it was such a wonderful 5 years that I spent there. In fact, when I eventually did move to Tennant Creek, Ivy appeared on my doorstep one day in our little place where we had in Tennant Creek, and she said, "Cookie, I come to live with you." And that was interesting because she was still a very tribal person, and she stayed with me for about 6 weeks before she got homesick and went back to Barrow Creek again. But
Yep.
I did form, you know, really strong relationships with people, which sadly fell away over the years because I was too busy building my business interests and things like that.
Sure.
So eventually the Barrow Creek pub got sold, and I spent some time in Alice Springs, and then moved to Tennant Creek to start a business with my new husband. We got married at Carlacaloo, the Devil's Marbles, which was an amazing outback wedding. And I cooked for the 100 guests at the wedding at the McLaren Creek station, which was just up the road. And people said, "Oh, you had such a lovely rosy glow at the wedding ceremony." Yeah, it was the rosy glow of the barbecue while I'd been getting the food ready for people. But so I sort of had that cooking thing in me by then.
Yep.
So yeah, in Tennant Creek in the early days, Tennant Creek was a very strong community, and you know, my husband and I set up a diesel business there, and which was a bit sad for me because I had my yearn for cooking by then, but he'd been, while we were at the Barrow Creek pub, he got a bit of a reputation as a diesel mechanic that could fix any generating set.
Okay.
He'd go out bush and fix a generating set that nobody could get going, and he always had a thing that he would never come back to town because he might be going 500 kilometres out in the bush. He'd never come back to town without getting that machine going again, whether it was the generator or the engine or the alternator that was the problem. So he was very much in demand as a diesel mechanic, and so I was left to run the workshop when I didn't know which end of an engine was up, and that made for a very short marriage because I'd get into trouble because the engine wasn't fixed when he got back from fixing someone's out bush, And the mechanics had been telling me that they were waiting for a Whatsit, you know, and I didn't know what it was, any part of it. So, but, you know, we became established in Tennant Creek, and by that time we also ran the Shell depot at that time as part of the diesel business. And it was all getting a bit too much for me because I was getting heavily pregnant with my first child. And I got my brother up, sucked my first relative up from Victoria to help me, got my brother up, Richard Dodd, who came up to help me run the fuel depot. I was getting a bit hard to roll the 200 litre drums around with a big belly, you know.
Yeah.
And so eventually when Clary and I separated, Richard bought his share of the fuel depot, and that started Richard and I in our business relationship together that's been ongoing for the last 50 years, and we've always supported each other in business.
Wow.
So, you know, Tennant Creek was a wonderful community in those days. I think, as I said before, it was a very vibrant community. There was a lot happening. At one stage we had lots of mines going, and, you know, Warrego, the satellite town that was a little bit out of town, had thousands of people living there. In fact, I remember one time all the houses were full, and there was 2 caravan parks out at Warrego, but they were so full that people were parked on the side of the road.
Wow.
There were so many people working at the different mines and the mining operations and the smelter. They had a mining smelter going for a short time.
Yep.
In Tennant Creek, we also had a meat works that was quite productive, and ironically, we had a horse works as well. So it was a very vibrant community with lots and lots of things going on. And I remember counting at one time there was 121 different clubs of all sorts.
Wow.
Going on in Tennant Creek.
Social type clubs.
So it was a very social clubs, all sorts, chess clubs, sporting clubs, you know, different scouts and guides and different all sorts of social community clubs and organisations. So so I had a great community life in Tennant Creek. Got involved in lots of things. I was the president of the Craft Council for 14 years, and we used to do lots of great things. But, you know, I had that yearning that I knew I was a cook by heart by that stage. And so my brother and I were very keen to start our own business. And my husband and I had separated by that time, and even though I was still involved in the diesel business, we were separating.
Yep. And
so we'd saved up just enough money to buy a block of land in Tennant Creek in the centre of town. And our dad, back in Benalla, had been a great squash player.
Right.
And the sport was pretty well entrenched in Australia at that time. It was quite a well-known sport.
Was that an American influence? How did squash sort of come to... Because I know, you know, Tennant Creek had a pretty strong baseball league as well.
Yeah.
I just wonder what was that influence that brought
I don't think
game of
squash was American. I think it was more English.
Okay.
But it was kind of like a highbrow sort of a sport in the early days. But then there was squash courts in every community in Australia, and I remember going around looking at them all when we decided. So our dad got killed very shortly after I came to the territory in a terrible accident down south. A front-end loader came down on his head when he was fixing it for someone. And that was devastating for us because, as I said, our mum had schizophrenia and Dad was the rock in our family. And so I was lucky to be able to, you know, come back to... I'd left my job at Barrow Creek and I had to come... I was lucky that they looked after me so well, and I was able to come back to it after getting things sorted for the family, because my brothers and sisters are all relatively grown up or at school and teachers' college and that by then. But Richard and I decided we wanted to have a squash centre in memory of Dad, and I wanted to have a restaurant. So we started designing what we thought would be a really good business for Tennant Creek. And that was the restaurant that became the Dolly Pot Inn and the squash centre. And we put a sauna and a spa in Tennant Creek. And why wouldn't you put a sauna in Tennant Creek?
One of the hottest places on earth,
I know,
a sauna.
Yeah. So we had this beautiful cedar sauna kind of right in the middle of the restaurant, and a spa where you know, you had to walk past it to go to the loos. So it was covered in glass. The building had a really sort of like a Scandinavian look about it, because we didn't want this big square building stuck out. So we designed it down into the ground, and we had David Hunt design it, who was the same architect that designed the Adelaide Festival Centre in Adelaide.
Wow.
So we were very lucky. That was before he designed our building way before he went off to do that. But so we're lucky we had innovative design. We didn't have enough money for the job. I remember going back to the bank about 3 times and wringing our hands and thinking that how are we going to do this? But somehow, it took us a few years, but somehow we got this this building built. And even then, there was another couple in town that had aspirations of building a squash centre as well. And so there was, for a few years in Tennant Creek, there was a sign down one end of town saying site of the new Tennant Creek Squash Centre, and another one down the other end of town saying site of the new Tennant Creek Squash Centre. And it's quite funny, the lady involved and I were both volunteering with Meals on Wheels, and as we were going around delivering the Meals on Wheels, we'd be sort of amping up how advanced we are with our building, which was all total bullshit most of the time.
Yeah.
But I can't remember what happened in the end, but obviously we won out. So our building went ahead, but it was a real struggle because we had no money. We were lucky that Westpac had just started in Tennant Creek, because Tennant Creek had always been a one-bank town.
Right.
And Westpac started in Tennant Creek, so there was a little bit more appetite for risk-taking at the banks. Even though they'd sent us away many times, this time the bank said, okay, we can take the risk, you know.
To secure your business.
Yeah, to secure it and give us a bigger loan than you normally would. But I remember one bank manager, because my husband and I had built a property in Tennant Creek by that time, and we owned a property, which is we were able to use that as a bit of a mortgage offset while we were separating. But I remember one time a bank manager in Tennant Creek saying to us, you know, you've totally overcapitalised your building here. Don't you realise that any building in Tennant Creek's not worth 2 knobs of goat shit? So that's been my standard ever since then for valuations, 2 knobs of goat shit. You know? I don't know where he got that from, but it was a crushing blow to me because I didn't know much about finance in those days, but I thought once you built a building, that was an ironclad asset.
Sure.
But, 2 knobs of goat shit was all it was really worth. So thanks for that. And that is true, that whenever we sold anything in Tennant Creek, we had generally overcapitalised on what we put into it, because we wanted to, you know, have things for the very best for our community. So, I remember sitting on top of Anzac Hill one day when we were just about to commit to the building of Tennant Creek. And I could have gone on being the wife or the estranged wife or doing my own thing in the business world. But here I was about to take this gigantic leap into debt that I couldn't even imagine how big it was, to lock myself into working my guts out for the next God knows how long. And that's and thinking, will I do this? Will I do that? I'm going to be always regret it if I don't, you know. And just the next day taking the big plunge to get to sign the papers and make the thing happen. So we had lots of interesting things making the Dolly Pot actually happen. I remember one day the builders, it was hard, just as then it was hard to get builders in Tennant Creek.
I'll bet.
And of course I was the nightmare owner, client, you know, poking around in the bricks looking at what they were doing every day. How deep was the hole for the spa? What were they doing here? Had they dug that hole deep enough for that? And this really good foreman, you know, would explain things carefully to me and blah, blah. And then one day I went down to site and there was no one there. And I thought, oh, that's a bit strange. And I went home, and then a day later I got a phone call from the owner of the building company saying, I can't get hold of the foreman. Can you just go down to site and get him to ring me? And I went back down there and there was no one there. It turned out the poor foreman had actually set out the building one Besser brick width out onto the laneway at the back, was council property, and they'd kind of built half the building around it, you know. And so he'd just gone.
Into the night.
Into the night, and the whole thing stopped. So that was a bit of a hold up for the while they regrouped and everything.
Yep.
But also the interesting thing about that building, it was one of the very first buildings that had preformed concrete walls.
Right.
And we had to get these two big cranes, or the builders did, one came from the mine, Warrego mine, and one came up from Alice Springs, to lift these gigantic slabs, and the whole town was watching because nobody had ever seen this kind of construction before for the squash court walls. So we had these 3 great big slabs built on the ground being lifted up. And I remember as we were watching, one fell off the crane, and instead of falling over, it just fell slightly against the wall of the other one that was already up and just chipped the corner of it.
Wow.
So there was sort of like you're going, oh my God, wow.
Yeah.
And then we had a big rainstorm that happened in Tennant Creek, as happened rarely, but when it did, it did. Or it does, like's recently happened. And went into the building site one day, and the spa was floating because it popped out of the ground. And yeah, so that was good fun watching that building. I learned a lot about building and watching that happen. Yeah. But anyhow, Ian Tuxworth, who was our local member and ended up being the chief minister, he was doing the opening ceremony of the building while I was still in the kitchen painting the range hood.
Right.
And then I remember when we started actually selling stuff, I had to quickly get someone to race down to the Pioneer Milk Bar and figure out what was their prices for cans of Coke, because we hadn't priced anything. That was how bad I was as a business person. But I was making great food in the kitchen.
Yep.
So, so I learned a lot about business in those years. But it turned out that was the boom time of Tennant Creek.
Mm-hmm.
And, you know, even though I was working like every hour known to man, and I became known as a real workaholic, and I stopped having any other kind of life, you know, we did pretty well in the beginning, and every night the restaurant was full, and people waited ages for their meals while we got ourselves organised and developed some systems which we didn't have before. And but they got good food, and it kept them coming back. And, you know, I thought, oh, right, so this is how easy it is to run a business. You know, just have to be prepared to dedicate your whole life to it. But I was a terrible boss. I was one of the worst bosses ever, because I was so stressed and I was so sure I was going to have things exactly how I wanted them that I wasn't very friendly to my staff in the kitchen. Right. And that's a whole other story about how I learnt to be a trainer. But you know, because Tennant Creek was doing so well, with so many people, and the population was more than 4,500 at that time, I thought, oh, well, this is easy. You just open up and off you go. And people were playing squash, and squash balls were landing in people's soup up on the deck, you know. Yep. And so we had a really, really good start to a business, even though I was stressed to the max all the time and never got enough sleep. Yep. But then one day, Eric Poole was the Minister for Tourism, and of course any new business was a thing for government, so they would always come there and highlight it and that. And he must have been talking to some tourism people. I don't know how it happened, but one day this light aircraft landed in Tennant Creek, and this person came in and had a meal at the Dolly Pot, and then flew out. I didn't see them, and I didn't even cook their meal. One of my apprentices did, but they went back and wrote in their American magazine called W, that was kind of like the elite magazine of America in those days, that one of the best meals they had in Australia was at this little Dolly Pot Inn in Tennant Creek. Wow. I started getting all these phone calls from media people all over Australia saying, oh, you've been named as one of the best restaurants in Australia. I said, what are you talking about? Like, I don't know anything about it, you know. Thought it was April Fool's Day or something. Yeah. But, and then, and that was really kind of like $1 million worth of free publicity for the Dolly Pot, and it got us on the map.
Do you remember what meal?
It was the veal parmigiana. And so, you know, and Channel 7 came up after that and did a whole thing on, I've still got, I don't know, the video's still somewhere, but me saying I used to feed the truckies, you know, and doing the veal parmigiana and all this sort of stuff. Because, you know, in those days, for us to make a veal parmigiana, I had learned off one of the miners who used to be an Austrian chef before he became a Tennant Creek miner. He would come in and show me how to make it, show me how to trim and cut the veal, what to buy. In those days you could actually buy yearling calves that were classified as veal.
Right.
My apprentices cut every finger on their hands, learning how to trim the sinew out of the veal. Then we would marinate it in our secret marinade, and then we would make our own breadcrumbs out of the leftover bread from the sandwiches, and we would crumb all our veal, and you could only have it crumb for a certain time so that it didn't get stale, and then we cooked it in a mix of butter and olive oil, that we'd learned how to make our own ghee and all that sort of stuff.
So it's very authentic.
So it was very authentic. It was pan cooked. It was never just chucked in the deep fryer like people do these days. Yeah. And so it had that real Austrian authentic flavour that the miners used to want to come in. And then we had our own homemade tomato sauce. So our butcher was Kenny Purvis down the road, who was another legend of Tennant Creek, and his Italian wife Maria Purvis, who's still a good friend. She taught me how to make proper homemade tomato sauce, the proper Italian way. We never used anything but fresh garlic and all of this sort of stuff and all the right herbs. So accompanied by our own special homemade tomato sauce that became a bit legendary in all our restaurants ever since. We had quite a unique dish, and a lot of our dishes were like that. They were garnered from learning from other people, because I was a real blotting paper in terms of learning whatever I could learn from people.
Yeah.
Yeah, so the Dolly Pot became quite well known, and we started to win Rolga Awards and things like that, and people started noting, what's this bloody mob in Tennant Creek that's a squash centre winning these awards from restaurants in Darwin, and things like that. So that's when people started to, take notice of it, and people often said to me they'd plan their trip up the track from Adelaide to Darwin or wherever they were going so they could actually call into Tennant Creek and have a feed and stay at your parents' place.
Well, I remember when we arrived in 92 and I first went to the Dolly Pot, just how busy it was. And I've got sort of really vivid memories even now of walking in and looking to the right-hand side where they had the names for the squash competition.
Oh, yes.
And the names basically were just falling off the page. There was that many of them. It was just unbelievable how many people were taking part in it even then.
Yeah.
It was just bustling.
Well, we did. I think, because it was an alternative to the pubs and clubs for people that wanted something different, it was a great little social centre. We had the Dolly dances there. We had this amazing lady called June that started a ballet school there.
I think my sister might have.
Yeah, I think maybe even you got roped in for a few productions. But but we had all ages of little ballerinas and other kinds of dance going on there. We had Dolly Volley. We started volleyball on the squash courts. We had indoor cricket. And of course, because my brother was involved, and my other brother that I'd sucked up to do a apprenticeship in diesel mechanics under my husband. Yep. And then I dragged my sister up there, Mary. She came up to Barrow Creek when she was 16 and fell in love with the place. And then after she'd been a librarian, she came back and helped me open the Dolly Pot. And I was back of house and she was front of house in the early days. So Mary's as much the story of the Dolly Pot as, as the rest of the family. So she actually met her fireman husband, Grant Hammond, in Tennant Creek, and they got married on the squash court and had their reception at the Dolly Pot. So
great.
Yeah, so it became a real family affair, and my sister-in-law Sandy was a teacher there.
She taught me.
She taught you, yeah.
Well, I think she was the librarian at the primary school and did teaching as well. But her daughter was in my year. Yeah.
Yeah, and my daughter Jessica remembers carpooling with you when
absolutely
when we used to grab all the kids and go to school together. And I think you were a little bit older than Jessica, but
no, I was a year younger. I was 1 year younger, and I remember Tony tooting the horn in the morning because we were always late to come out. So, yeah, we couldn't get our act together in the mornings, you know, mum and dad running the motel. So,
and trying to, we all had
Get
very
kids
busy
dressed.
lives. In fact,
That's right.
I don't think I was the very best mother because I would just be saying to my kids, go and wash some dishes if they'd come and bother me about doing anything. And I remember one distinctive day that Jessica will never let me forget, when she had a pet rabbit, beautiful little white bunny, and it was show and tell at school. And I was sworn to bring the rabbit down for recess time to show and tell. So I put the rabbit in the little van that we had, and off I went down to the school, and everyone loved the rabbit, and I stayed for playtime, and then I picked the rabbit up to bring it home again, and just as I got back to the Dolly Pot, some crisis happened in the kitchen, and I raced in to fix it and forgot the rabbit. And so the rabbit
Met its demise.
sadly,
Poor
and
thing.
I never got over that. Like, what happened to my rabbit? Oh, it escaped and ran away, you know, like when I was bringing it home. But years later she found out about that, and I think she's still got a trauma in her background about the poor rabbit. So, yes, I had, I certainly was one of those mothers that that prioritised business, because I always used to say I would have sold my grandmother's soul, who was one of my protectors when I was young, rather than go bankrupt. And I think that's, my kids suffered from that. Yeah, so. But, you know, they were great years because Tennant Creek was such a great community in those days.
It really was.
We all looked after each other, and there didn't seem to be as much social divide as there is now. So, but they were great years, and I got totally involved in all aspects of community life in Tennant Creek. And I remember, because I'd been so interested in pottery and that, and while I was still running the diesel business, I had a bit of spare time to do that sort of stuff. And we even built, like the government gave us a whole house in Tennant Creek just to have as our craft centre. And we used to get funding to have visiting craftspeople come and do craftspeople in residence and fibre people in residence and all that. We had a really vibrant craft community. And so when I built the Dolly Pot, because I was a really interested potter, I built a little foyer out the front of it where I thought I was going to continue with craft council activities and do a little bit of pottery and play a lot of squash and make a few cakes occasionally. Well, I never touched the pottery wheel ever again. I was the last person in Tennant Creek to ever play squash, I reckon. And I spent a lot of time at 2 a.m. scrubbing floors, you know. So the reality of life really hit me. But, you know, they were still great years. They did pass in a bit of a fog, and you wonder where they all went. But, the community was, you know, so full of great things happening. But then, you know, in 1990, Marshall Perrin was Chief Minister, and he decided that the economy of the territory needed a big haircut, and they brought in the Economic Review Committee. And from what I remember of those days, they centralised a lot of the government departments that had been running in Tennant Creek and communities, and everything went back to Darwin or Alice Springs to be operated from. And that meant so many middle management type people left the community, and their wives and their families. So where there was so much community activity, that fell back, you know. And it's never really recovered, I don't think, you know. So
did that sort of coincide with, you know, the meatworks wrapping up, and then some of the mines, you know, maybe finishing?
Definitely.
So it was sort of, it all coincided?
It all sort of culminated in that time, and then I found that running a restaurant was actually much harder than I thought, you know. So, the Tennant Creek population just bottomed out because the mining booms finished, and Warrego smelter closed, which was devastating for all of us, and all the promise of the White Devil mine that was going to cause another 20 years of boom, that all stopped. And so Pico mine had finished. All the mines virtually closed down because of the mining boom was over in Australia for that time.
Yep.
And the meatworks, instead of me cooking cheval for all the European buyers that used to come to buy horse meat from the horse works,
Yep.
that all closed down as well, and even the meatworks closed down. So, yeah, so many people left Tennant Creek. It was kind of like last one out, turn out the lights, you know. And I think, as I said to you before, a lot of businesses really suffered. And I always used to say after that, once I moved business to Darwin, if you think it's hard in Darwin with the boom and bust economy, try 20 years or so in Tennant Creek and see how you go, you know. Because we really, in those days, we really had 3 or 4 months a year to really make our good money, and the rest of it was more like survival.
Yep.
And I learnt that more when after the Dolly Pot, so during the Dolly Pot time, my brother was running the Shell depot, and that was a really good business, and he did really, really well, developed it from nothing. And so we were both seen as, and to be honest, I think in a bit later on, the Shell depot even subsidised the Dolly Pot a bit, you know. So,
right.
But we were seen as good business people, and it was a time when the government was trying to develop Indigenous business, and so they started talking to us about doing a joint venture business with Jalalakari Council Aboriginal Corporation, which...
Do you mind just moving the mic? Yeah, just a little bit over that way.
Which was...
yeah, that's perfect.
Which Jalalakari at that time was a really grassroots Aboriginal organisation, and we worked very closely with the early start-up of that organisation, started by amazing people like John Haven and David Curtis, people like that had a vision for Aboriginal business and helping Aboriginal people have the same opportunities that non-Indigenous people had. And of course, I had started to realise, started to develop a little bit of a social conscience, even though I was so focused on business.
Yep.
But I started to realise there's something really wrong with a society where I could come to the Northern Territory with the clothes on my back and make a business for myself and my family, and yet all the local Aboriginal people that made me so welcome to their country weren't having the same opportunity. So when the opportunity presented for us to get into business with Jalalakari, of course we were really excited about that. And it was another stepping stone into business that I knew nothing about, because we were dealing with IBA, Indigenous Business Australia, which was a government entity that was helping set all this up. And they had ways of developing business that we didn't understand for about the first 6 years that we were actually in that business.
Right,
So
was that a Commonwealth?
yeah, Commonwealth,
Okay,
yeah.
yep, sure.
It was Commonwealth and Northern Territory getting together.
Okay.
So Prospect NT was formed, and that was taking the tiny little service station in the middle of town that my brother had bought and started, which was a BP service station. And I remember about the first day that we opened up there, Richard opened up, the turnover was about $300 and something for the day. And we had these photos up on our walls saying Ricky's Challenge, which was what the service station looked like as a little tin shed and that, and what we wanted it to look like, you know. And but by the time that Jalalakari bought into the business, Richard had already done a lot of renovations, and the business was quite booming because we had the fuel depot and the service station. But the government helped Jalalakari buy their share of the business, and then it turned out that the business actually had to pay that loan back to IBA through the profits on the business. So there was this very complicated business arrangement that we still didn't understand, as I said.
Right.
But, you know, over the years what we did understand was that the only people that had any real skin in the game were Richard and I, with all our homes mortgaged and everything, to make sure that we didn't take advantage of Aboriginal people and just, you know, use the money for ourselves.
Yep.
So it was a really good, robust system for making sure that if the business failed, it was on us.
Right. And was that the first time in your experience that there was government assistance, towards the training and employment opportunities for Aboriginal people, or
I think there was a lot of stuff happening, but we weren't aware of it because we were we were in our own little silo. But I think there was a lot of development going on. You know, Paul Everingham had decided to, when they got self-government, he had sort of like a bit of a blank check to develop the territory and set up everything.
Right.
And I think they were determined that Aboriginal business would come along with everything else.
Mm-hmm.
And there was a lot of stuff happening in Darwin and Alice that we sort of weren't privy to. But it certainly was the time when there was a lot of joint ventures going on that became quite successful, like the Kittle Brothers one in Alice Springs, and like the Nintmaluk, the Wernasani Catering one that became the whole Nintmaluk Gorge and big empire that's happening in Catherine now that's Aboriginal owned. So there's a lot of really good initiatives like that did get Aboriginal people into business that might not have happened otherwise. So I think it was a very important time, and we really loved it because had developed a bit of a social conscience by them, and I realised that this was a bit of a way that we could pay it forward in those days. And so not long after that, my second relationship was on the rocks, so to speak, with poor Tony. And so everyone had been saying, you should have a Dolly Pot in Darwin, you know. And I'd been put on a few government committees, so I was seeing business from a larger scale. Like I remember once when I was on a tourism committee travelling out to Kakadu with the manager of the Travel Lodge, which was one of the few high-rise buildings in Darwin at that time, and sitting in the back seat with bigwigs going out to Kakadu talking about business. And it was sort of like this mind-blowing moment that I suddenly realised that even though I had all my issues of business in Tennant Creek with staffing and running a business and money management and all that sort of stuff, the Travelodge man had the same issues, just on a absolutely different scale. Yeah, so that was those kind of interactions and being on those committees were really helpful, and that's why I sort of advocate for the cross-fertilisation of new businesses, because I was like, very raw in I certainly didn't have great business practices. I was lucky I had that huge passion,
Sure.
So, so anyhow, so at that time we had a Dolly Pot Inn going at Fanny Bay as well, and I would often get on the Pioneer bus or the in Tennant Creek and travel up to Darwin to be there for the opening of service the next day, and two restaurants 1,200 kilometres apart when I wasn't really that good as a manager. That was a bit of a nightmare time. But our prospect business was starting to go really well. Richard was doing really great things, and it was after I'd been running the two restaurants for about 4 years that I realised that people started saying to me, "We know where you are by the standard of service, whether it's in Tennant Creek or Darwin."
Sure. And
I'd also started doing airline catering to supplement business in Darwin. I knew that I had to get out of the restaurant business, and I'd moved out to TIO Stadium. I'd been volunteering out there for the Arafura Games, taking food out there, and I saw this sort of disused kitchen out at the TIO Stadium, and I thought, what the hell's this? Cantillas.
Yep.
And so I managed to get a lease on that, and then quickly sold both the Dolly Pot in Tennant Creek and in Darwin.
Just before we
Yep.
get into the TIO, how did you find the operating environment in Darwin compared to Tennant Creek? Was it fairly similar? You know, were your clientele much different? How did you sort of find that?
Okay, so I'm going to tell you a story here.
Okay.
Look, it was easier, much easier
In Darwin.
in Darwin, and my landlord in Darwin, the wonderful Finocchiero brothers, I remember Ross Finocchiero. So the Dolly Pot in Darwin was 2 stories, and it was an amazing building that they'd built. And before we moved into it, it had been a Chinese restaurant that was really, really struggling. So it was sort of a struggling business. It wasn't a business really. And so when we moved in there, of course, everybody that we knew from up and down the track flocked there. And we had our function room upstairs and we had our restaurant downstairs. And so I hired some amazing people in Darwin. One of those was an amazing lady called Stevie Greenwood, whose father had the Rock Oyster restaurant in Darwin, and she'd been brought up in the kitchen sink, just like my lovely kids had. And so she was doing the functions upstairs. But so the Finocchiaros would be standing outside on the footpath, and this building would be heaving with people, and they'd say, where did all these customers come from, you know? And I'd say, oh, they're all my mates from Tennant Creek that have come, you know. So we had a fairy tale start to restaurant business in Darwin. And once again, I thought, oh, this is how it happens, you know. But then, a few years after that, I was actually on the Northern Territory Tourist Commission, and I served 2 terms under Barry Coulter as the Tourism Minister, as the member for the representative of the Barkly region. Mm-hmm. And one day, we were shown the plans for a whole village of restaurants that was about to start called Cullen Bay. And I went home and did some more research on how well developed that village already was. And I thought, oh, okay, a whole village. Because at that stage, you know, we'd be booked out weeks ahead. Like, it was hard to get into the Dolly Pot in Darwin. Mm-hmm. But then I'd already thought that I wanted to get out of restaurants because it was too stressful having them so far apart. And we'd started in Cantillas, and we were getting more and more airline catering, and I was enjoying that totally new concept of having to have all these special requirements to go airside and all that sort of stuff. And so that's when I decided it was time to get out of the restaurant business and go into catering. And so, so the climate that running a restaurant in Darwin was certainly easier than running one in Tennant Creek. Mm-hmm. But same challenges, but not as bad.
Right.
Certainly not that same boom and bust economy that we had for years in Tennant Creek, and that we were experiencing still down there with our service station, with our joint venture down there. So anyhow, by that stage, I was really keen to do something towards changing society a little bit and closing the gap. And it just turned out that 2 of my former staff members from Tennant Creek, one of them, the wonderful Julie Calvert, who'd been one of my first apprentices, because I trained more than 65 apprentice chefs in Tennant Creek at the Dolly Pot.
Amazing.
I found it was the only way, and once I learnt to be a trainer, and that's another story, I found that was the only way to maintain the quality.
Right.
And we had our whole kitchen as a training kitchen. I'd have a first, second and third year apprentice always, or 3 or 4 of them. Mm-hmm. And there was much more leniency in terms of training in those days. And you know, often the apprentices they all used to go to Alice Springs for their block release. And I often felt that sometimes I had to untrain them when they came back, because they'd pick up all these fancy ideas that weren't really applicable. Besides which, they'd learned how to have weekends off. But, you know, but Julie Calvert will still tell you how all the other apprentices in Alice Springs, like the butchery apprentices and that, they would go off and have their weekends off in Alice Springs and play merry hell, whereas my poor apprentices had to get on the bus, come back to Tennant Creek and do the weekend shifts in the restaurant, you know. So all my apprentices always reckoned that they hated my guts, but gosh, they could work anywhere after they worked for the Dolly Pot. So, but anyhow, Julie Calvert and the amazing Sarah Hickey, who used to be one of our first likely lads and had a reputation for being able to peel a whole 20-kilo bag of potatoes in 20 minutes in Tennant Creek. And they used to get paid, and they'd sweep the squash court floors and all that. They'd get paid in ice cream sundaes until they became more productive. But they both came back from overseas travel and landed in Darwin about the same time and came back to start working for me again. And we just realised we really clicked. And I had this another amazing lady that had been working for us doing what we had our Karen's Kitchens by that stage as well at BP service stations. And Amanda had put up with hell and high water after I rescued her from the RSPCA as a migrant worker. And she and so I said to these three young women, what about we start a new business and we can all be equal shareholders? And that was in 2006, and that was probably the best business decision I ever made, because I had these three gung-ho people and myself as the grandmother, and they just went for it, you know. And that's when we started doing the V8 catering and doing the Kimberley Moon Festival in Kununurra. We used to take a road train full of food over and set up in a paddock for 600 VIP diners and do chocolate sculptures in a paddock like that I'd spend all night up doing, and all sorts of wild things. But the fact was that actually let me out of the kitchen for the first time. It was Cantilla's kitchen by then.
And was that in Amanda's hands?
No, that was in Julie Calvert's hands.
Sorry, Julie's hands.
Julie's hands, yeah. Sorry. So Julie took over the kitchen.
Yep.
By that time, my daughter Erin had already also decided, because when Erin was brought up in the sink in Tennant Creek,
yep,
she decided she didn't want to have anything to do with food again after she'd had so much. Go and fix this, take these out, make that sundae, do this, crumb this veal. She escaped to Melbourne for a few years, but then she realised she had food in her blood. So she came back and did her apprenticeship, helping us do airline catering in Darwin from Cantilla's. So, but Erin didn't really want to stay in the kitchen. She wanted to do things of her own as well. By that stage, she'd become qualified as well, went through CDU. And so she started her own little restaurant called Erin's at the Airport, the Aviation Institute. And Julie stepped into the kitchen at Cantilla's and let me out of the kitchen for the first time, and took over most of the cooking as our business was growing. And she and Sarah and Amanda just formed this amazing partnership. Everyone had their own roles, but like Sarah was business development, Amanda was the function manager,
right,
and they all just used their special skills to develop the business. And it let me out of the kitchen, and I then decided we were going to close the gap, you know. We knew how to do it because I'd tried to employ so many people in my business in the Dolly Pot Inn in Tennant Creek and in Fanny Bay. And in fact, I'd had about 6 Aboriginal apprentices in Tennant Creek, but only a few of them stayed the whole apprenticeship.
Yep.
And I always had a deal with my apprentices. They always moved ahead 1 year ahead of their year, and were at a different year ahead pay rate.
Yep.
And they always finished in 3 years because we had such a concentrated training environment in Tennant Creek. So, but yeah, so I knew how to run a business, but I was struggling to employ enough Aboriginal people to really make a difference. Mm-hmm. And so our company formed its training division, and we became a registered training organisation. We won a contract to become panel members with the Australian government as on an Indigenous employment panel, which we kept for 12 years really, and through all the ups and downs. And we started our Future Stars program. And Jessica and I actually started developing the first modules of our Future Stars program, which was understanding from our life in Tennant Creek where the big gap was between people being able to wanting a job but not being job ready, not having that job muscle, and what employers needed. So we started doing our program, and that was when Stevie Greenwood came back into my life again. She'd left and gone to run the race course, the race day at the Darwin Cup Carnival, the Turf Club.
Right.
And then she'd decided she had enough of hospitality, and she'd challenged herself by becoming a Thank You Mr Hooker real estate agent, and she won all sorts of accolades, selling more real estate in Darwin than anyone else, and doing the whole mindset of learning how to take 100 knockbacks a day and not lose your mind, you know, and doing all that power of the mind stuff. So anyhow, I bumped into Stevie one day and I said, "Hey Stevie, can you just come and talk to the participants in my program? I've double booked myself." And she said, "Oh, what will I talk about?" I said, "Just talk about yourself. They love hearing stories of people that are successful." So she went and told these 9 Aboriginal trainees that we had in the room at Cantilla's the story about her life, and as a Greek family in Darwin. And of course they all just really loved it and clapped her, and she said, "What in the hell are you doing? This is amazing," you know. And so she left her real estate job and joined our Future Stars program, and she brought all that wealth of brain training. We even used things like The Secret and all those very basic ways of helping people understand what the opportunities they had when they couldn't get up. We used to say get up in the trees, but now it's get up in the drones and see what your opportunities for life are, you know. So the Future Stars program, we got the opportunity to roll it out in Alice Springs, Tennant Creek, Elliot, Darwin and Catherine and Elcho Island over the years. And even though most contracts that we got with the government were short-term contracts, we managed to scrabble together bits and pieces of different funding to enable us to do it, you know, for holistically.
Yep.
And, you know, thousands of people went through the Future Stars program, but we always felt we didn't have the opportunity to work with them long enough to really help them make a difference.
Right.
And that's where we started understanding about the role of mentoring. And so we started developing mentoring programs as well, using, once again, every bit of psychology and brain learning we could get from other people as well, because I've always been that blotting paper that listens to what's going on somewhere else. How can I apply it here, you know?
Yep.
So over the years, we managed to develop quite a strong Indigenous employment program, and that, of course, was helped by having a half share in an Indigenous-based business in Tennant Creek still, in Prospect. And Richard developed Prospect really well. We met a long-lost cousin at our mum's funeral in 2011 who Richard said, "Hey, come up and build, need to build a fence in Tennant Creek, come up and help me build it." He came up and helped me build it, and that was Michael Dodd, who's still there today running his own cafe. But he became an intrinsic part of helping develop the training and getting our Indigenous employment stuff really going. So the most successful program we ever had was one where in Tennant Creek we managed to cobble together all the different facets that we needed to help people. The program only went for a year, but it was called the Tenant Transition Accommodation Program. And we even managed to have accommodation in the mix where we joined forces with the Eldorado, and they gave us a wing of their motel that they weren't using at the time, and we turned that into accommodation for people in our program. So over the years we've done many, many different programs, but I guess the thing we've learned is that to really close the gap and make a real difference in helping people that are below, you know, in the Northern Territory right now, any Aboriginal person that actually wants a job or is employable, can have their job or their career of choice, because there's so many organisations that want to close the gap, either through the fact that it's the right thing to do, or they've got quotas or government contracts that ensure they do that.
Yep.
But the fact is there's still many people who simply don't have the work muscle and are not ready to jump on the employment opportunities. And over the years we've seen so many well-intentioned government programs at all levels to change that, but often from our learning from the bottom up, they're so misdirected, and that's why I've sort of got myself as a bit of a Barclay Battleaxe reputation in Canberra for saying nationally consistent programs just don't work in the Northern Territory, you know, it's got to be something different. And we have seen some changes, we've seen a lot of changes, we've seen a lot of really good stuff happening. We're seeing a lot more Aboriginal people in places. Because, you know, in 1994 I said in an interview in Tennant Creek will only come into its own when all the key roles are filled by Aboriginal people with local knowledge.
Yep.
We're still not seeing that reality, but we are in that generational change that's very painful, but not in my lifetime, but in the future. I'm quite positive that will happen, but we're seeing a lot of social upheaval in the meantime. So nowadays, so anyhow, what happened with the catering business, Sarah, Amanda and Julie and myself spent many years, 20 years, doing all sorts of catering all over the place, doing lots and lots of major events. We had the catering contract at Parliament House for 12 years that we had it on our own, and then we had a shared contract a couple of years before that. So 15 years working out of Parliament House in Darwin, where we used every single opportunity, whether we were catering for Barack Obama or a school mob of school kids, to highlight Indigenous training and opportunities for what we call our incubator programs, where people are working in a protected employment environment but building their work muscle, and being intensively mentored along the way. We also had the catering at TIO Stadium, at the AFL football stadium. We were there for 27 years in the end.
Amazing.
And then because of the fact that we'd been doing a lot of cyclone recovery catering at Elcho Island and all sorts of things, we'd worked very closely with AUSMAT in, you know, lots of different trauma situations. It turned out that during COVID, Delaware North had the contract to run the Howard Springs village and to do the catering for all the domestic people that came there. But AUSMAT came to us and said, look, we want something different. We'd like you guys, we're about to take over the international catering out at Howard Springs when the government's going to start bringing Australians home, and they're going to start using Howard Springs. And by that time, we were facing bankruptcy as a catering company, because I'll never forget going into our catering office one day and Amanda, hardy, Liverpudlian, hard-nosed lady, who I'd never seen cry, was sitting on the floor crying her eyes out because we'd lost millions of dollars worth of forward catering contracts in a week when COVID hit. And we just didn't know what we were going to do. We were so lucky when the government brought in assistance measures and we could at least keep our core staff, because things closed down in Parliament House, there was no football games, nothing. All our catering just stopped overnight. But Amanda, the ever astute businesswoman, had been nurturing her contacts with AUSMAT and that sort of thing, and that's when we got the opportunity to start doing that catering. We weren't doing it at Howard Springs. We started doing it at half the cold food at TIO Stadium and the hot food at Parliament House, and driving out in our little trucky trucks, converging in a car park at Howard Springs where Colin West had built us a tent, and we'd hired some containers, built a kitchen in the car park and distributed our meals out there in the very beginning. But the passionate way that we always did things and the homemade quality of our food started to be recognised by social media as a point of difference. And so we got the opportunity then to take over all the catering through a contract. We got the opportunity to tender in a contract, and we eventually moved out to Howard Springs Village, and we'd persuaded them we needed that kitchen to do the work in. So that kitchen was mobilised. That was an amazing whole complex. I remember the first day I went into that kitchen complex, I put my handbag down and I couldn't find it for half an hour, you know, it's so big. But at the end of the after 18 months in there, we were saying we need more containers out the back, you know, we need to expand. So it was such a groundbreaking opportunity. It was like we practiced for 50 years as caterers to do that job. Mm-hmm. And we had such amazing people working with us, developing spreadsheets. And I mean, if you can imagine, in the height of our time at Howard Springs, the whole village was laid out in rows of 6 units. Okay. And in each of those 6 units, there was one person. Families sometimes had a few units and things like that, but you might have in one unit a person that was just a normal person, a normal food requirements, normal dietary requirements. You might have someone that had an egg allergy in the next one. You might have a pregnant person in the next one. You might have someone from a country that didn't eat certain foods in another one, and so on. Or you might just have had someone that was vegetarian or vegan. So as well as our normal standard dietaries of halal and kosher and all those, sure, we had 169 other specialty dietaries that we were catering for, and our regular dietaries, but also you'd have the people that couldn't have any black pepper, or people that couldn't eat orange food, wow, or people that couldn't eat wobbly food, like, you know. So imagine every day between 5 and 7 p.m, the food trolleys with all the nutritional requirements for 3,000 people, or I think it was 2,800 people was the maximum we had, but then we were serving the staff as well, because they didn't want the staff leaving because of COVID restrictions. Yep. We had devised these special trolley arrangements that would go between the rows and dole out 2 paper bags of food, hot and cold, on each veranda. Fully PPE'd, we had to do the whole COVID PPE thing, and each bag had to contain sometimes 16 parcels of food for that whole nutritional requirements. And that food was all made in our kitchens, and it was all freshly made, you know. We did outsource a lot of it to help some other businesses in town that were really struggling. Like we'd get one dessert a week made in one place, or one croissant for our menus, so that we were helping other small businesses. Yeah, sharing around. But that was such I would look at our teams, and I'd set out there, you know, 5:30 in the morning and get home at midnight every 7 days a week for 18 months. None of the 3 of us had, the partners had any time during that time at all, you know. But it was like it went so quickly. And so after that experience, when it finally finished, but the key thing about that for us was that in that restaurant, in that kitchen, we had turned that into an incubator, and we had more than half our kitchen most of the time were Aboriginal people in either their first job or coming back to work after a space or having all the challenges. Yep. And we used Saltbush, the organisation that we'd set up a few years previously, as our way of paying it forward, Saltbush Social Enterprises, which is now an Aboriginal organisation with Aboriginal people setting out to solve the challenges of their own, you know, of their own people. We trained mentors on the job and then took them off, and they helped people. So if someone didn't turn up, we'd have a duty of care to go and find out if they were okay, because they wouldn't notify us very often, and make sure they're okay, help them overcome their challenges and come back to work. So that was a beautiful that was what kept me going out there every day, was the amazing opportunities that it gave so many people.
Were there any special people? I mean, they're all special, but some of the trainees or apprentices that came through your program at that time, was there any sort of special case studies that you remember?
Oh, well, there's lots of them. And because of the fact that we were running government programs as well, of course, we have very good in all our programs, we have good news stories. When somebody reaches 6 months in employment, we, pay a lot of attention.
Celebrate it.
Celebrating that and helping them write a story about their journey and whatever they want to share, and helping them move on. So lots and lots of those good news stories, and lots of people that came out of our business that have moved on to really great things. So untold, or not untold, but certainly so many, I can't remember. There's many of them that we use to help us in our programs. For instance, this young man here on the front of our latest annual report of Saltbush, he doesn't mind me saying that he did our program 6 times over the years. He started in 2009 doing our first Future Stars program, and had many ups and downs in his life, but eventually a few years ago he was back in the program again and was starting to really understand where he wanted to go with his life. We helped him get into a job at the Vibadina, and Henry is now the training as an assistant manager. He's been the Indigenous liaison manager for Vibadina and Travelodge for quite a few years now, and in a full circle he's helping us employ other people through his programs. Fantastic. That he's developed in the hotel. So those kind of stories are the really heartwarming ones, but there's many others along the way that we've made stories about and done stories about. Last year's annual report was Emily Majana, who ironically used to go to school at Nolan's Bore in Aileron, where the Nolan's Bore Arafura rare earth mines about to start soon. Emily's got an amazing story to tell, but basically she's come through the ranks and now as a grandmother. She's on the board of Saltbush because we always want people with that lived experience that understand what it's like. Mm-hmm. She became a qualified chef through our ACE program, Accelerated Aboriginal Cooks of Excellence program, at Parliament House and TIO and at Howard Springs. She ran sessions at Howard Springs, supervised groups of people learning, and she was a great motivator for Aboriginal people, seeing this grandmother working 12 hours a day, putting food together and always encouraging them. So there's lots and lots of many stories of how people have taken advantage of the opportunities that we've been able to put in front of them to make changes to their lives. Yep. So at the end of Howard Springs, Sarah and Amanda and I looked at each other. Julie had actually left the organisation by that time because she'd wanted to get out underneath the Karen Sheldon banner, which I can totally understand. I browbeat them for all those years. And she started her own business and she's been very successful. She's now got Little Miss Flowers and her own catering business that's doing very well in Darwin. But Sarah and Amanda and I looked at each other and thought, wow, after this experience, we can't go back to cleaning up after a wedding at 2 a.m. on a Sunday morning. And people said, why didn't you sell your business? But we wanted to maintain the good reputation we had and to be able to pass that on to Saltbush as its founders. Sure. Even though we wanted to divorce ourselves eventually from Saltbush and make sure it's identified as what it is, an Aboriginal managed and operated not-for-profit, focused on grassroots change. But we still wanted to make sure we could hand over whatever resources we could. So we closed our company down, closed our long-term contracts, didn't re-tender for things, and simply decided that the three of us would go our own separate ways after all those years together and do something different. And of course I'm at 76. I'm pretty near ready retirement anyhow. So that's what we've been doing for the last few years, and we spent, like, for instance, we might have someone working with us for 3 months but not working with us. They might have been studying to go on to their next career. So we made sure we really looked after all the staff that had worked with us so long and did great things. Young Jenny, an amazing Aboriginal young lady that she and I used to do presentations in Parliament House Speaker's Corner Cafe to the tour groups that came through, talking about my journey in Indigenous employment and her journey as one of our participants, where she used to be a cutter because she had such, like, often I'd have to go and pick her up from hospital because she hadn't turned up for work and had been so depressed, you know, she'd cut herself, those kind of things. But Jenny had been the face of our cafe for so long. I met someone in Melbourne a couple of weeks ago and they remembered coming to Speaker's Corner and they said, this amazing Aboriginal girl or lady you had there looked after us so well. And I said, yeah, that was Jenny. Jenny then got a fantastic job with Venture Housing, and now she's even had a couple of increases in her employment there, so she's well on her way to her own future. And so these are the stories that make you keep, you know, doing what you're doing. A lot of people that started out having a really good story, they fall backwards because they're back in that environment that people don't understand the total challenges that presents to people. But, you know, we keep doing this work now, and I'm lucky that in my retirement I'm able to be sort of like a little bit of a backbone for Saltbush, helping them. But there's amazing teams of people that are the Saltbush story now that are moving forward, and very soon I'll back right off just to becoming a patron.
Right, so you still maintain some involvement with Saltbush?
Only as co-chair at the moment of Saltbush, voluntary, and only, but not anything operational.
Right.
But just trying to fundraise for Saltbush, and we've got and looking at my 5 decade of history in trying to, you know, close the gap. Looking at what I've seen as the good, bad and ugly, and understanding at that really grassroots level how we can make a bigger impact. I started developing a program called Foundation to Future, which is where I'm trying to get, because I was president of the Northern Territory Chamber of Commerce for nearly 3 years, so using that experience as well to get big business involved that wants to really find a grassroots way of making a difference, and using really strong measurement tools, using social economists to help us measure the impact of Foundation to Future to make a real difference. So that's my mission at the moment, working alongside Saltbush to then embed that program and then step out of their way once it's up and going.
So is that sort of ultimately how you see you know, your career sort of winding down, is once you've finished up with Saltbush, left them in a good stead? Do you see, is that retirement then for you?
That is sort of retirement, but you know, over the years, with both Saltbush and the Karen Sheldon Group, we've done a lot of food with bush foods, native and bush foods, working with the amazing Raylene Brown from Coongas and Cook in Alice Springs, who's also a Saltbush board member now. I see so much potential for Aboriginal business in bush foods, and I see startups happen, and then I see things not work out, and then I see other startups. And what I'd like to do is just work with organisations to make sure that all the available information that's been gathered over the years, like we had a 5-year history with the University of Queensland in their uniquely Australian bush foods setup, and we got some amazing IP and things on things like wattle seed that grows around Tennant Creek, and Kakadu plum and things like that. There's a huge lot of knowledge out there that sometimes doesn't get all gathered at the right place at the right time. So I'd just like to play a part in making sure that knowledge gets to the right people. And I love helping small business startups, but one of the things you've got to be very careful with, you can have your own passion and see what you think might be a great business opportunity, but you can't bring that out. You've got to make sure you're just supporting someone that's got their own vision and presenting them with opportunities or smoothing the way, not trying to drive them. You've got got to make sure you don't try to drive. And that's really hard for me, but it's something I'm learning to do.
Yeah. Well, on that note, I couldn't think of a better note to finish this podcast. Thank you. It's been an absolutely fascinating story. And what we like to do at the end of the pod is just to give our guest a bit of an opportunity just to spruik anything that you'd like to promote. Is there a way that young people can get involved in what you're doing, a website, anything like that? The floor is yours.
Oh, thank you. Well, this is the annual report, the latest one of Saltbush Social Enterprises. We've got a hub now in Nylander Street in Parap. We've also got bases throughout the territory, particularly any young Aboriginal person, young or old, that's looking for a job. Saltbush is there to help. But any business people that want to know how to be a part of closing their gap, it'd be wonderful to get in touch with Saltbush and see how they can work with Saltbush as an employer, as a donor, or any way sharing their skills with Aboriginal job seekers.
Yep.
Because it's when you get people together with a shared vision that you really get great things happening.
Absolutely. All right. Well, everyone get involved.
Yeah.
Karen, thank you very much. It's been an honour having you here. So, yeah,
Thank you,
all the
Stuart.
best.
I didn't know I
Cheers.
could talk so long.
All good.
How long was that?
Thanks, everyone.